All right, so today we're going to deep dive into some really interesting stuff, I think, in U.S.-India trade relations.
Okay.
We've got this article from NDTV
Right.
about a speech that then President Trump gave to Congress back in 2025.
Okay.
And let me tell you, this speech really kind of shook things up in the world of international trade.
Yeah, it certainly did. This wasn't just another policy announcement. This was like a bold statement. It
Yeah.
kind of revealed where things were going with
Yeah.
global trade in the mid-2020s.
Exactly. So Trump steps up to the podium and announces his plan to impose these reciprocal tariffs on India.
Right.
And his main argument was that their auto tariffs were over 100%
Wow.
at the time, which he felt was really putting American automakers
Yeah.
at a disadvantage.
Yeah, and that was a key plank of his America First agenda, right?
Right.
He saw these tariffs as a direct threat to American jobs and businesses,
Yeah.
and he was determined to level the playing field.
To level the playing field now, I remember this being a pretty big deal at the time. But for those who maybe need a little refresher,
Sure.
can you explain what exactly is a tariff and how does it impact trade?
Yeah, so in simple terms, a tariff is like a tax
Okay.
that's imposed on goods imported from another country.
Right.
So if India placed a 100% tariff on cars imported from the U.S.,
Right.
the price of those cars essentially doubles for Indian consumers.
Oh, wow.
So that makes American cars much less competitive
Right.
compared to cars that are produced in India.
Gotcha. So it's a way for a country to protect its own industries by making foreign goods more expensive.
Exactly. And countries have been using tariffs for centuries to influence trade flows
Oh, wow.
and protect their domestic markets.
Okay.
But you can imagine it can also lead to trade disputes and even trade wars.
Right. And that's kind of what happened here, right?
Yeah.
So Trump's call for reciprocal tariffs essentially meant that if India was going to hit American cars with a 100% tariff, the U.S. would respond in kind.
Precisely. He argued that this reciprocity was necessary to force India to lower their barriers and create what he considered fairer trade conditions.
For American companies, but this wasn't just about economics, was it?
Well,
Trump's language in the speech was very assertive.
yes, very confrontational. It was very typical of his style.
Yeah, he even said something like, nobody can argue with me when it came to these reciprocal tariffs.
He did. And it sent a strong message that he was serious about taking action
Right.
and protecting American interests, even if it meant risking a trade war.
And how did India react to this? I mean, they weren't exactly known for backing down from a challenge.
Well, yeah, from their perspective, these high tariffs were essential for protecting their own burgeoning auto industry.
Okay.
India was still a developing economy at the time,
Right.
and they saw this as a way to nurture their domestic manufacturers
Yeah.
and create jobs.
So it's this classic example of two countries with very different economic priorities trying to navigate
Exactly.
this global trading system.
Absolutely, and it highlights that inherent tension that exists in international trade. On one hand, you have this desire for free and open markets,
Right.
which can lead to greater efficiency and lower prices for consumers.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you have the need to protect domestic industries and jobs,
Right.
especially in developing economies.
Yeah, and finding that balance is never easy, especially when you have powerful leaders
Right.
like Trump who are willing to play hardball.
Indeed, and this particular episode in U.S.-India trade relations is a great example
Yeah.
of how those tensions can play out on the world stage.
So Trump makes this bold declaration setting April 2nd as the deadline
Okay.
for these reciprocal tariffs to take effect. What happened next? Did he actually follow through?
Well, things didn't unfold in quite the way many people expected.
Really?
It wasn't a simple case of the U.S. imposing a mirror image of India's tariffs.
Oh, so there's a twist.
There is.
What did Trump actually do?
He went with quotas instead of tariffs. He announced limits on the number of cars India could export to the U.S. each year.
Okay, so a quota instead of a tariff. What's the strategic difference there?
So they're both trade barriers, but they function in different ways, as we discussed. A tariff is a direct tax,
Right.
raising the price of the imported good. A quota restricts the quantity allowed in, regardless of the price.
So it's less about making Indian cars more expensive for American consumers
Yeah.
and more about just controlling how many come into the U.S. market.
Exactly. It allows for more of a targeted approach.
Yeah.
Trump probably saw it as a way to exert pressure
Yeah.
without igniting a full-blown trade war with tit-for-tat tariffs.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. So it seems like he was trying to walk a fine line there, protect American automakers, but without, totally alienating India.
Right.
What was their response to this quota strategy?
Yeah, they were not happy, predictably. They saw it as protectionist,
Yeah.
designed to stifle their auto industry's growth. Remember, their high tariffs on U.S. cars were part of their larger strategy
Right.
to support their domestic manufacturers who were still developing at the time.
Right. It creates this interesting dilemma, you know?
It does.
The U.S., this like mature economic powerhouse, wants open markets. And India, this like rising economy, feels the need to protect its industries
Yeah.
until they can compete on a global scale.
It's a classic clash of economic interests.
Yeah.
And it plays out time and again on the world stage.
Yeah, for sure. So I imagine India wasn't going to take this lying down. Did they retaliate?
They threatened to.
Yeah.
There was talk of imposing their own tariffs on key American exports,
Oh, like what?
things like agricultural products,
Okay.
and maybe as a symbolic jab, Harley-Davidson motorcycles.
Oh, really? Wow. Hitting Americana where it hurts.
Right.
So did they actually go through with those retaliatory tariffs?
They didn't, at least not initially, it seems. They preferred to pursue a negotiated settlement.
Yeah.
Rather than escalating the situation into a full-blown trade war, there was a lot of diplomatic activity happening behind the scenes.
Right. I mean, even amidst these economic disputes, both countries had other shared interests to consider, right?
Absolutely. The U.S. and India, despite their differences, are key players in global affairs.
Right.
Things like security cooperation, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region,
Right.
meant that severing ties completely wasn't really a desirable outcome for either side.
So they had some pretty strong incentives to find some kind of common ground.
They did.
Did those negotiations eventually bear fruit?
They did. After months of tense back and forth, a limited trade deal emerged.
Oh, really?
India agreed to lower some of its tariffs, notably on agricultural goods and those motorcycles.
Okay.
And in exchange, the U.S. relaxed some of the quotas on Indian cars.
So not a complete victory for either side, but a negotiated compromise?
Precisely. It allowed them to de-escalate the situation
Yeah.
while saving face on both sides.
Yeah.
And it also demonstrated, at least in that moment, a willingness to find common ground,
Right.
despite their competing economic interests.
But I imagine this whole episode left its mark. It really exposed some like fundamental differences
Oh, yeah.
in how the U.S. and India approached global trade.
Absolutely. It was a microcosm of a larger trend we were seeing in the mid-2020s.
What?
A move towards more assertive, even protectionist trade policies.
Oh, wow.
Countries both developed and developing were becoming less shy about using tariffs and other tools to defend their own perceived interests.
Which, of course, has implications for businesses and consumers worldwide, right?
Without a doubt, when trade tensions rise, businesses face uncertainty, supply chains get disrupted,
Yeah.
and ultimately consumers often end up paying higher prices.
Right.
It underscores just how interconnected the global economy truly is.
Yeah.
Political decisions in one country can ripple outwards, affecting people thousands of miles away.
It's a reminder that economics and politics are deeply intertwined, especially on that world stage.
Indeed, and this episode in U.S.-India relations highlights another crucial point, the use of different tools beyond just tariffs to achieve strategic goals.
Right. We saw quotas, threats of retaliation, and ultimately a negotiated settlement. It's almost like a high-stakes game of chess with global economic ramifications.
It is a very apt analogy.
Yeah.
And this game, so to speak, is far from over. While the specific trade spat between the U.S. and India may have subsided, the broader trends towards protectionism and strategic maneuvering in trade continue to shape the landscape today.
Which begs the question, what lessons can we learn from this episode?
Yeah, it feels like we're in this era where the rules of global trade are being rewritten in real time.
Yeah.
Right. So as we navigate this new landscape, what should countries, businesses, even individuals be paying attention to?
Well, I think first and foremost, this episode highlights the need for adaptability and strategic thinking,
Yeah.
Gone are the days when trade policy was this relatively static field.
Right.
Today, countries need to be nimble. They need to be able to respond to sudden shifts and unexpected challenges.
So less sticking to rigid ideologies and more just being able to adjust on the fly.
Precisely. This U.S.-India case shows how, a single policy decision, like Trump's call for reciprocal tariffs, can set off this chain reaction with unforeseen consequences. And it wasn't just about tariffs, right? We saw quotas, threats of retaliation, and ultimately this negotiated settlement.
Right.
It seems like the toolkit for influencing trade has expanded quite a bit.
Absolutely. And that toolkit is likely to keep evolving as technology advances, supply chains become more complex, and the geopolitical landscape shifts. We can expect even more creative approaches to managing trade relationships.
So it's not enough for leaders to just understand traditional economic theory. They need to be savvy political strategists as well.
Exactly. Trade is no longer just about maximizing efficiency and minimizing costs. It's about national security, strategic alliances, even domestic political calculations.
This really brings to mind a point you made earlier about this growing trend toward protectionism. Is that something we should be concerned about?
It's certainly a trend worth watching closely. While protectionist measures can sometimes be justified, especially for developing economies, they can also lead to unintended consequences.
Like retaliation from other countries or like a slowdown in global economic growth?
Exactly. History has shown us time and again that trade wars rarely have winners.
Yeah.
In the end, they tend to hurt everyone involved.
So how do we strike that balance? How do we protect domestic interests while also ensuring that the global trading system remains relatively open and fair?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's no easy answer. But I think it starts with open communication and a willingness to negotiate in good faith.
So more diplomacy, less saber rattling.
I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah.
We also need to recognize that trade isn't a zero-sum game.
Okay.
There's room for everyone to benefit if we can find ways to cooperate and create a level playing field.
Yeah, it's a complex challenge, but it sounds like there's also a lot of opportunity if we approach it with the right mindset.
I completely agree, and I think episodes like this U.S.-India tariff drama, while challenging, offer valuable lessons for the future. By studying these cases, we can better understand the dynamics at play and hopefully chart a course toward a more sustainable and prosperous global trading system.
Well said. This deep dive has been a fascinating exploration of the complexities of international trade. We covered a lot of ground today, from the basics of tariffs and quotas to this high-stakes game of global economic diplomacy.
Right.
And I think the key takeaway here is that trade is about far more than just economics. It's a reflection of our interconnected world with all its opportunities and challenges.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive, but the conversation doesn't end here. As we've seen, the world of trade is constantly evolving, so stay curious, stay informed, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp. Until next time, thanks for joining us on the deep dive.